Hi guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here. And before I begin, I just want to wish everyone a happy 2021. Welcome back to the new semester, and I hope everyone had a fantastic break. I am here to kick off chapter 21, which is all about a time period that is known as the Progressive Era. So the Progressive Era is a time period that is typically defined as taking place between 1890 and 1920. And it is when American citizens call upon the government to solve problems that are created by the Industrial Revolution. And so these problems are going to range from political issues such as political machines, from social issues such as living conditions in the cities and in the tenements, and economic issues such as monopolies. And so again, progressive reformers are going to call upon the government to take an active role in solving these issues. Okay, so again, 1890 to 1920. And again, the government should pass legislation to address these issues. And again, there are a lot of issues. I'm not going to go through all of them, but many of these issues we've actually already talked about in period 6. And now we're looking at, okay, what was the government's response to some of these issues? So that is known as progressivism or the Progressive Era. Now, we know from past chapters that the Second Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s is typically defined as the mass production of materials like oil and steel. So we heard names like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, and some economic issues that we discussed was the rise of monopolies, which we know is unfair to the American consumer. And due to the fact that there was no real government oversight, it allowed for monopolies to continue to grow. We also know that there were many labor strikes during this time period. We know that there were workers advocating for, shorter work days and higher wages and safer conditions. Typically during the strikes that we looked at, the government usually sided with big business, but these are some of the economic issues that will be addressed during the Progressive Era. Additionally, we've got some social and political issues, and I think those two are linked to the rise of immigration and urbanization and the rise and the growth of American cities. So during this time period, we know that many immigrants, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, came to the United States to work in America's factories and live in America's cities. And the growth of these cities is known as urbanization. So within these cities, we see some political and social issues. We see the rise of political machines. We see poor living conditions like tenement houses. We see air pollution. We see overcrowding. We see children kind of wandering the streets. And so again, this is just kind of an overview of some of the issues that will be addressed during this time period, again known as the Progressive Era. I think it's also important to note that many progressive reformers were kind of inspired by early reform movements that started under the populists in the late 1800s. So if you guys recall, the Populist Party really kind of started with the farmers. And the farmers were looking for the government to solve a lot of their own issues that they were facing. And they called for things like the direct election of senators, government ownership of things like railroad, telephone, and telegraph companies. They even considered industrial workers and advocated for an 8-hour workday. If you guys remember, one of their biggest platform issues was the coinage of silver, known as bimetallism, to put more money in circulation to help farmers out of debt. And we also know that they turned their attention to William Jennings Bryan, and he kind of carried that cross of gold, if you guys remember that speech, and tried to advocate for the populists when he ran for the presidency in 1896 as a Democrat, but as we know, he lost. And while the Populist Party kind of died out, a lot of these ideas are carried on into the Progressive Era. There are definitely a lot of differences between populists and progressives. Obviously, populism is more of a movement that circulates at first among farmers, whereas progressives are more based in the cities. Populists called for a little bit more like direct government ownership, whereas progressives are just really going to look for the government to pass laws to protect Americans. And the progressives are going to be a little more diverse. You're going to see more women and African Americans and even religious leaders taking part in the progressive movement. So I guess the next question is, if I'm an American and I live in Chicago, how do I even know what some of these issues are? How do I know the issues facing maybe an industrial worker? Well, you know what? I know because I read about it. And how do I read about it? The muckrakers. So the muckrakers during this time period are essentially investigative journalists who kind of uncover and expose a lot of these problems. And they're going to write books and they're going to publish articles in magazines and they're going to take photos. And Americans are going to read these books and read these magazine articles, and they're going to read about the tenements, and they're going to read about political machines and monopolies, and they're going to call upon the government to do something about it. So we've got the issues, the muckrakers expose the issues, and the progressive reformers call upon the government to pass legislation to try and solve the issues. Now, you guys are going to hear more about specific muckrakers in some of the next few videos, but I just want to mention that probably two of the more famous muckrakers were Upton Sinclair and Jacob Riis. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which was a book about the meat packing industry in Chicago. So what happens in a slaughterhouse and what goes into the meat that Americans are consuming. So again, if I'm, living in Chicago and I pick up this book and I read it, and I read about rats and poisoned bread going into the meat that my family's consumed, I'm going to be horrified, right? I'm going to want somebody to fix that problem. And so The Jungle's going to call upon the government to protect our food and make sure that working conditions are also safe and sanitary. Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, and he actually used the power of the camera, and he went into the tenements, specifically on the Lower East Side in New York City, and he took photos of how immigrants specifically were living. And people saw, these windowless tenements with no indoor plumbing or electricity, and they would see these photos and they were horrified. And again, they would call upon the government to pass legislation to hopefully help people living in these conditions. Again, most of the progressives are middle class, educated, urban dwellers. They live in the cities. And I think it's important to note that the wealthy would not be considered progressives because many wealthy business owners kind of benefit from the way things are done currently. And obviously, maybe poor citizens or immigrants wouldn't maybe be involved necessarily in this movement, specifically because, they need these jobs to survive. So that's why you see mostly kind of middle class, kind of younger city dwellers calling upon the government. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the first progressive president, if you will, and he will serve in office from 1901 to 1909. He was William McKinley's vice president. William McKinley was assassinated in 1901, and Roosevelt assumes the office. And he actually develops a reputation as being a trust buster because he will go after monopolies. He will protect the food that Americans are eating, and he will really become known as the progressive president. After him, Presidents Taft and Wilson also have some level of progressive reforms during their tenure in office as well. And so you're going to hear more about that. But ultimately, here's what I want you guys walking away with, is that the progressive era is often defined as this time period from 1890 to 1920. Muckrakers kind of unearth these, social, political, and economic issues that many Americans are facing as a result of industrialization, and they're going to call upon the federal government to actually pass laws to solve these issues. So there you go, guys. That's the progressive era. You're going to learn more about the specifics in the next few videos, and have a great day.